Hey folks, tonight we're diving into one of history's most absolutely brutal stories. The kind that makes you realise royalty wasn't all velvet cushions and wine, despite what the Netflix shows suggest. We're talking about Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, a woman who got dealt one of the worst hands in Renaissance history and somehow managed to keep playing long after everyone thought she'd fold. This isn't your typical princess gets married, lives happily ever after tale. This is about a girl raised in power's gleaming shadow, shipped off to marry a Scottish king she'd never met, widowed before she could legally drink in most places. And then it gets properly complicated. Over the next few hours, we'll follow her through marriages that weren't really marriages, political betrayals that would make your head spin, exile, scandal, and a quiet kind of defiance that nobody really talks about. She's the reason Scotland and England's crowns eventually ended up on the same head, and yet most people couldn't tell you her name. And before I forget, hit that like button if you are enjoying this, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Right then. Let's start at the beginning, though the beginning is messier than you'd think. She was the eldest daughter of Henry VII, the king who was famously so stingy he probably counted the individual grains of salt on his dinner table, and Elizabeth of York, who was basically the living embodiment of a keep calm and carry on poster. Margaret was born in 1489 at Westminster Palace, which back then was a sprawling, drafty, somewhat chaotic mess of a building where the smell of the Thames probably invaded every single room. You have to imagine this little girl, the Princess Royal, though they didn't really use that title then, being groomed as a sort of high-stakes diplomatic bargaining chip from the moment she could wobble across a stone floor. She was the spare to the spare, until she wasn't. It's funny, isn't it? We always focus on her brother, the one with the 6 wives and the appetite for turkey legs, but Margaret was the one who actually had to go and survive in a place that genuinely wanted to eat her alive. She wasn't particularly tall, or short, just sort of there. She had that Tudor temper, the one that's like a slow-burning fuse attached to a very large barrel of gunpowder. Her early years were spent at Sheen or Eltham Palace, away from the smog of London, where she played with her brothers Arthur and Henry. I wonder if she ever looked at Henry, who was just a chubby little boy then, and realised he'd eventually become the sort of man who'd execute his friends for looking at him sideways. Probably not. Kids are notoriously bad at predicting the future. They were just children. They had monkeys for pets. Actually, Henry VII bought Margaret a marmoset, which I imagine caused absolute carnage in the tapestries. Can you imagine the laundry bill? Anyway, the world Margaret inhabited was one where your father didn't look at you and see a daughter. He saw a bridge made of flesh and bone and a very expensive dowry. England and Scotland had been at each other's throats for centuries, mostly because they were bored or cold or someone's cow wandered over the border. Henry VII, being the spreadsheet-loving king he was, decided the best way to stop the Scots from raiding the northern pantry was to send them a Tudor girl. It's quite grim when you think about it. She was barely 6 years old when the talk of marrying her off to James IV of Scotland started. James was already a grown man with a collection of mistresses and a very impressive beard. There's a certain creepiness to the whole Treaty of Perpetual Peace signed in 1502. Perpetual. What a word. Men love using words like perpetual when they're about to do something that's going to fall apart in 20 minutes. Margaret was only 12 when the proxy marriage happened. She was dressed in white damask and crimson velvet, standing in a chapel at Richmond Palace, while a Scottish earl stood in for the king. He touched her hand and suddenly she was a queen. A child queen. She spent her last few months in England being taught how to be Scottish, which I assume involved learning how to deal with rain and people who didn't like her father. Her mother, Elizabeth of York, died around this time, which must have been a crushing blow. Losing your mum at 13 and then being told you have to move to a foreign country to sleep with a man you've never met. It's a lot. I'm not sure you could have handled it. There was this one moment during her final days in England where she went to say goodbye to her father, Henry VII. The man who was usually about as emotional as a damp brick actually cried. Or so the chronicles say. Maybe he just had something in his eye. but he gave her a gold salt cellar and some very stern advice about being a good girl. She left London with a massive entourage, riding a white palfrey, looking back at a home she would never see again. It was a slow, agonizing trek toward the border. The roads were horrific. Mud. Constant mud. She stopped at various great houses along the way, being feasted and stared at like a prize pony. I bet she was exhausted. Every night she'd have to sit through another 5-course meal of roasted swan or whatever they were eating, smiling until her face hurt, knowing that every mile north took her further away from the only life she knew. She reached Berwick-upon-Tweed, the last English town, and you have to wonder if she considered just turning the horse around and bolting. But Tudors don't bolt. They endure. The Scottish border was this invisible line that changed everything. On one side, she was the beloved princess. On the other, she was the English woman. The air gets thinner up there, or maybe it's just the atmosphere. James IV met her at Lamberton Kirk, and he tried to be charming. He was a Renaissance man. He spoke 6 languages. He practiced dentistry on his courtiers for fun. Seriously, he paid people to let him pull their teeth. And he was obsessed with ships. He rode up to her, jumped off his horse, and gave her a big theatrical greeting. Margaret, being 13, was probably just trying not to cry. He did this thing where he tried to show off his horsemanship, galloping around and looking kingly. It's the 16th century equivalent of a guy revving his engine at a red light. Margaret seemed impressed, or at least she had the sense to look impressed. They moved on to Edinburgh, a city that was basically one long, narrow street perched on a volcanic rock, smelling of peat smoke and dried fish. The wedding at Holyrood Abbey was a massive affair. They called it the marriage of the thistle and the rose. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Very poetic. But roses have thorns and thistles are literally designed to be painful to touch. They spent the night together, and just like that, her childhood was officially deleted. Did James actually like her? He was kind to her in his way. He gave her jewels. He gave her palaces. But he also kept his mistresses close by, which must have been a lovely welcome to married life. Here's a necklace, Margaret, and by the way, that lady in the corner is the mother of my 3 favourite illegitimate children. Delightful. Margaret had to find her feet in a court where the nobles were basically warlords who happened to own some silk. They didn't trust her. Why would they? She was her father's daughter. She spent a lot of time writing letters home complaining that she was lonely. Her father, in his typical style, told her to stop whining and be a queen. But there was a spark in her. She wasn't just a victim. She started to learn the Scottish game. You see, being a Tudor meant you had a natural instinct for survival, a sort of predatory awareness of who was standing behind you with a dagger. She began to carve out a space for herself at Holyrood and Stirling. She had children, most of whom died in the cradle, which was the brutal reality of the time. Every time she got pregnant, it was a roll of the dice with her own life. It's funny, we think of these people as statues, but she was just a teenager, trying to figure out how to run a household where half the staff wanted her country to fail. Then her father and Arthur Tudor both died. Her brother, the young, still has all his hair, Henry VIII, took the throne. And that's when things started to get really messy. Henry didn't care about the perpetual peace. He wanted glory. He wanted to invade France. And because Scotland had an old alliance with France, James IV was stuck between his wife and his oldest ally. Margaret was in the middle of a tug of war between the 2 most ego-driven men in Europe. She tried to talk James out of it. She told him about her dreams. She claimed she saw visions of him falling. Maybe she did. Or maybe she was just smart enough to know that the English army was a bunch of professional killers. James wouldn't listen. Men rarely do when they think there's a chance to win a battle. He gathered the biggest army Scotland had ever seen. He marched south. Margaret was left at Linlithgow Palace, pregnant again, staring out the window at the road, waiting for news. And then came Flodden. Mind you, the mess that followed Flodden Field was unlike anything the Scots had ever seen. A literal generation of nobility wiped out in a single afternoon of mud and blood, leaving Margaret sitting in Linlithgow with a heavy belly and a heart that must have been hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. James IV was dead. Not just dead, but mangled. They found his body, or what they thought was his body, and sent it to London in a lead coffin, where my personal theory is that her brother Henry VIII probably kept it in a shed for a bit before losing it. It's a bit gruesome, really. But for Margaret, the grief was a luxury she couldn't afford, because she was now the Queen Regent for a toddler, James V, a boy whose crown was essentially a target painted on his back. She had to act fast. The Scottish lords were a prickly bunch at the best of times, always arguing over who owned which cow or which castle, and now they had to take orders from an Englishwoman. Can you imagine the atmosphere in that council chamber? Thick with the smell of damp wool and distrust. They didn't want her. She was the sister of the man who had just butchered their husbands and fathers. Still, James IV had been clever enough, or perhaps just sentimental, to leave her in charge in his will, provided she stayed single. Staying single. That was the catch. I've always found it fascinating how we expect these historical figures to be these iron-willed statues of virtue. But Margaret was lonely, terrified, and probably hadn't had a decent night's sleep in months. She gave birth to another son, Alexander, a few months after the battle, a posthumous child. Such a heavy word for a tiny baby. She was surrounded by men like the Earl of Angus, Archibald Douglas, who was young, had a decent bit of chin, and knew exactly how to whisper the right things in a grieving woman's ear. Angus was a bit of a lad, honestly, tall and about as deep as a puddle. Margaret fell for him, hard. It was probably the biggest mistake of her life. Or maybe it was just a desperate grab for some kind of warmth in a country that felt like a freezer. They married in secret at Kinnall Church in 1514. It was a disaster. The moment the news leaked, the Scottish lords went ballistic. She'd broken the terms of the will. She was no longer the pure widow. She was now the wife of a Douglas. And in Scotland, if you weren't a Douglas, you usually spent your time trying to kill one. The council decided to bring in a real man to lead. Enter the Duke of Albany. Albany had been living in France, but spoke barely a word of Scots and probably thought the whole country was a backwards pit of despair. But he was a Stuart, so he was the chosen one. Margaret was suddenly the villain in her own story. She holed herself up in Stirling Castle with her two little boys, refusing to hand them over. You think about her standing on those ramparts, looking out over the cars, wondering if her brother Henry would send an army to save her. He didn't. Henry was busy being the centre of his own universe. She was under siege, literally. Albany arrived with cannons, big, heavy, don't-mess-with-me cannons. Margaret stood at the gate of Stirling holding the hand of her tiny king and told Albany to go away. It's a brilliant image, isn't it? A lone woman defying an entire army with nothing but a toddler and a lot of Tudor nerve. But nerve doesn't stop cannonballs. She eventually had to give in. They took her sons. That's the bit that always gets me. The image of her watching those little boys being led away by men who might very well have wanted them dead. She was pregnant again, this time with Angus's child. Life in Scotland had become impossible. Her husband was proving to be a bit of a wet blanket, more interested in his own power than her safety. She decided to run. It wasn't a grand exit. It was a frantic, terrifying scramble through the dark toward the English border. She was heavily pregnant, riding through the cold, probably wondering if she'd go into labour in a ditch. She made it to Harbottle Castle in Northumberland. It was a grim, freezing fortress, not exactly the luxury she was used to. There, on a cold October night, she gave birth to Margaret Douglas. This baby would eventually become the mother of Lord Darnley, but that's a whole other mess for another night. For now, Margaret was just a woman on a floor, exhausted, bleeding, and safe. Barely. She stayed in England for a while, hoping Henry would be the doting brother. He wasn't. He treated her like a political nuisance. He gave her a house, sure, but he also lectured her about her unseemly marriage to Angus. Pot meet kettle, right? Henry lecturing anyone about marriage is the peak of 16th century irony. I bet she just wanted to scream at him. While she was in London, Angus did the unthinkable. He got bored of waiting for her and went back to Scotland to make his own peace with Albany. He didn't just go back. He started living with his former mistress in Margaret's own houses. using her money, wearing her carpets out. It was a betrayal that turned her heart into a piece of flint. She'd risked everything for this man, her regency, her sons, her reputation, and he couldn't even keep his trousers buckled for a year. She decided she was going back, not for him, but for her son, the king. By the time she returned to Scotland in 1517, she wasn't the starry-eyed girl who'd married the handsome earl. She was a woman who wanted blood, or at least a very expensive divorce. She started playing a dangerous game, writing secret letters to the French, then to the English, then to anyone who would listen. She was becoming a master of the double cross. It's funny how people call her fickle. I think she was just tired of being everyone's pawn. She found a new ally, or a new distraction, Henry Stuart. He wasn't an earl, he wasn't particularly powerful, but he was there, and he wasn't Angus. Her obsession with getting rid of Angus became the driving force of her life. She wanted an annulment. She claimed Angus had a pre-contract with another woman, which was the standard get-out-of-marriage-free card back then. The Pope, however, was a bit busy dealing with her brother Henry's own matrimonial disasters. Margaret was stuck in a sort of political purgatory. She managed to get her son, James V, declared of age when he was only 12, mostly so she could shove Albany out of the way. She was the one pulling the strings again. For a brief moment, she was the power behind the throne. She had the boy, she had the council, and she had a new man in her life. But Angus wasn't finished. He came back to Edinburgh with an army, literally scaling the walls to try and take control of the king. Margaret actually ordered the cannons of Edinburgh Castle to fire on her own husband. That's the level of domestic dispute we're talking about here. Not a thrown plate or a slammed door, but actual artillery fire. She missed, unfortunately. Angus took the king, and Margaret was once again sidelined, watching from the shadows as her husband turned her son against her. She was living in a small house, short on cash, while Angus lived in the palace. So there she was, stuck in the damp Scottish hearth, watching her husband Angus basically play king for a day, while her son, little James, was kept under a sort of gilded house arrest by the Douglas family. The way they travelled back then was absolutely miserable. No shocks on the carriages, just wooden wheels hitting every rut in the road. Margaret was fuming. She was living on the outskirts of power, writing these frantic, ink-stained letters to anyone who'd listen, mostly her brother Henry, who was currently busy being obsessed with a certain Anne Boleyn and couldn't be bothered with his sister's little Scottish problems. Margaret, sitting in a draughty room in Perth or Stirling, clutching a shawl because the Scottish winter is the sort of cold that gets into your actual marrow, plotting how to steal her own son back. She wasn't just a mother, she was a Tudor whose ego had been bruised. Angus was using the king's name to sign all sorts of dodgy land deals, enriching his own kin, and generally acting like he owned the place. He didn't. He was just a placeholder. There was this one time, and I love this detail because it shows how petty things got, where she tried to get her jewels back from Angus, and he basically told her to get lost. It's like a messy breakup where the guy refuses to return your favourite hoodie, except the hoodie is a crown's worth of rubies and gold. Margaret wasn't going to take that lying down. She started building a faction, a group of lords who were just as fed up with the Douglases as she was. She turned to the French again. She didn't actually like the French all that much, but they were a means to an end, a way to poke her brother Henry in the eye while also undermining her husband. She was playing a three-dimensional game of chess while everyone else was playing checkers, or maybe they were playing marbles. Who knows? The point is, she was isolated. Her husband had the king, her brother had the money, and she had, well, she had her wits. And a very sharp tongue. She began to spend more time with Henry Stuart. He was the captain of her guard, a man who didn't have the grand pedigree of the Douglases, but seemed to have the one thing Margaret actually craved: loyalty. Or perhaps he was just better at faking it. It's hard to tell with these historical flings. Was it true love, or was it just a "thank God you're not Angus" kind of vibe? I tend to think it was a bit of both. Stuart was younger, and he didn't try to rule her. Not at first, anyway. Then the breakthrough happened. In 1528, James V, who was now 16 and had grown a very impressive Tudor-esque stubbornness, managed to escape Angus's clutches. He dressed as a groom, snuck out of Falkland Palace in the middle of the night, probably smelling of horse manure and damp hay, and rode like a madman to Stirling. Margaret was there. She was waiting. Can you imagine the relief? The boy king was finally a man, and his first order of business was to banish his stepfather Angus forever. Margaret thought her time had finally come back around. She married Henry Stuart almost immediately. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the ink to dry on her annulment from Angus. She just did it. Mind you, her son James wasn't exactly thrilled. He'd just spent years being bullied by one stepfather, and here was his mother bringing in another one. It's the classic "I hate my new stepdad" trope, but with more beheadings. James actually threw Henry Stuart into prison for a bit. He wasn't playing games. He was his father's son, but he had his mother's temper. Margaret had to beg, literally get down on her knees to get her new husband out of a dungeon. It must have been humiliating for a woman who had once been the regent of the entire kingdom. She was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that her son wasn't her little boy anymore. He was a king who saw her as a bit of a liability. It's a bit tragic if you think about it. She'd spent 15 years fighting to keep him safe, fighting to keep his crown, and the moment he finally gets it, he treats her like a nuisance. She was still trying to mediate between Scotland and England, trying to stop Henry VIII from being a complete bully, but Henry was now in full, supreme head of the church mode. He didn't have time for a sister who was constantly asking for money or complaining about her husband's legal status. There's this one letter where Henry basically tells her to shut up and be a better wife. The hypocrisy is just staggering. This is the man who was currently tearing apart the entire religious fabric of Europe because he wanted a new wife, telling his sister she should just put up and shut up with Angus. Margaret's response was, predictably, a lot of Tudor fire. She wasn't going back to Angus, never. She'd rather live in a shed. Actually, she was living in Methven Castle by then. It wasn't a shed, but it wasn't Whitehall. She was starting to feel her age. The constant riding, the stress, the pregnancies that had gone wrong, it all takes a toll. She was getting these nagging pains, what she called the palsy, which might have been a series of mini-strokes or just the result of a life lived at 100 miles an hour. She kept writing letters, thousands of them. She was obsessed with getting James to meet Henry. She thought if the two of them just sat down for a beer, or the 16th century equivalent, they'd realise they were family. It was a nice thought, utterly delusional, but nice. Henry VIII wasn't looking for a nephew, he was looking for a vassal, and James V wasn't looking for an uncle, he was looking for respect. Margaret was caught in the middle of two giant egos, like a piece of parchment between two grinding stones. She started to feel that Henry Stuart, now Lord Methven, wasn't the saint she'd imagined. He was starting to look at other women. He was starting to spend her money on his own interests. It was Angus all over again, just with a different name. I wonder if she ever looked in the mirror and just sighed at her own taste in men. It's a recurring theme with the Tudors, really. Great at ruling, absolutely rubbish at choosing a partner. She even tried to run away back to England at one point. She got as far as the border, but James caught her. He wouldn't let her leave, not because he loved her, but because an English queen mother living in London was a political nightmare he didn't want to deal with. She was a prisoner in her own country, a queen without a crown, watching the shadows grow long over the Scottish hills. The early days of her widowhood were a right old mess of conflicting emotions and damp castle walls, especially since she was now essentially a single mother in a country where the local hobby was kidnapping royal children. She had to stay at Stirling, which is a magnificent place if you like grey stone and the constant threat of a siege. But she wasn't just sitting there knitting. She was the regent. She had the seal. She had the authority, at least on parchment. But in reality, she was a woman trying to hold a handful of water. The Scottish lords were circling like sharks that had smelled blood in the water. And honestly, can you blame them? Their king was dead, and the only thing standing between them and total chaos was a 24-year-old Englishwoman who they suspected was probably reporting back to her brother every time they sneezed. She felt the cold, not just the Scottish weather, which is its own special brand of miserable, but the social chill. There is a theory that Margaret suffered from what we'd call imposter syndrome today, though she'd never have admitted it because she was a Tudor and admitting weakness was basically a capital offence in her family. She was constantly writing to Henry VIII, asking for money, asking for advice, asking for a sign that he hadn't forgotten she existed. Henry, meanwhile, was busy being a young, flashy king in London, probably spending more on a single banquet than Margaret had in her entire treasury. It's funny, isn't it? The way siblings can be so close as children and then become complete strangers once a crown and a few hundred miles of boggy land get in the way. The Earl of Angus, Archibald Douglas, was one of the men who stepped into that vacuum of loneliness. Margaret married him in a rush, just a year after James IV died. It was a scandal that rocked the foundations of the Scottish government. By marrying a Douglas, she hadn't just found a husband. She'd picked a side in a bloody, multi-generational gang war. The fallout was immediate. The other lords, particularly the Hamiltons, were absolutely livid. They didn't want a Douglas as the king consort in all but name, and they certainly didn't want Margaret to keep the regency. She lost her status almost overnight. The law said that if she remarried, she forfeited her right to be the guardian of the king. She tried to fight it. She barricaded herself in. But you can't fight an entire parliament with just one handsome husband and a couple of loyal guards. This is where the Duke of Albany comes back into the frame. He was the backup Stuart, living it up in France, and the Scottish lords sent for him like he was a long-lost messiah. Margaret hated him before he even set foot on a boat. She saw him as a usurper, a man coming to steal her children and her power. When he finally arrived, he didn't exactly play nice. He was sophisticated, he was French-influenced, and he had a very clear mission: get the kids. Margaret's life became a series of small, desperate rooms. She moved from castle to castle, trying to stay one step ahead of the council's orders. There's a story, it might be true, or it might just be the kind of legend people like to tell about desperate queens, that she once stood on the battlements and threatened to throw herself off if they tried to take her sons. I doubt she'd have actually done it. She was far too pragmatic for a grand tragic gesture. But it shows the level of drama we're dealing with here. Eventually, though, the food runs out, the wood for the fire disappears, and the men-at-arms start looking at the exit. She had to surrender the boys at Stirling. It must have been a gut-wrenching moment. She stood at the gates, clutching the hands of James and Alexander, and handed them over to Albany's men. After that, she was just a woman with a husband she was quickly realizing was a bit of a liability. Angus wasn't the great protector she'd imagined. He was a Douglas first and a husband second. Actually, he was probably a Douglas first, second and third. She decided to make a break for it. She was pregnant again. The woman was almost constantly pregnant, which is an achievement in itself considering the mortality rates. And she decided she'd rather have the baby in England. She fled south, but the Scots weren't about to let a valuable pawn just walk across the border. She ended up at Harbottle Castle, which sounds like something out of a Dickens novel, but was actually a cold, damp fortress in the middle of nowhere. She was incredibly ill. The fever was so bad they thought she was going to die. She lay in a dark room, sweating and shivering, while the wind howled through the Northumberland hills. She gave birth to a daughter, Margaret Douglas, who was so small and weak they didn't think she'd last the night. Mind you, she did last, and she grew up to be just as much of a headache for the English throne as her mother was for the Scots. Angus, meanwhile, showed his true colours. He didn't stay with his sick wife in the cold castle. He didn't wait for her to recover. He saw which way the wind was blowing in Scotland and decided to head back and make his own peace with Albany. He essentially abandoned her in a ditch. Well, a castle, but it felt like a ditch, to save his own skin. Margaret was left alone with a newborn baby, no money, and a brother in London who was starting to find her letters a bit much. She eventually made it to London, but it wasn't the triumphant return she'd dreamt of. She was a refugee, a failed regent, a woman whose husband had ditched her for a mistress and a quiet life back in Edinburgh. She stayed at the English court for a year, but she was a ghost of her former self. She had lost her sons, her husband, and her country. She spent a lot of time talking to her sister Mary, who had also had a bit of a wild ride as the Queen of France before marrying for love. I wonder what those two talked about over their embroidery. So, your husband died and you married a duke. Well, mine died and I married a traitor who's currently living in my house with another woman. It's the kind of sisterly chat that usually involves a lot of wine. Margaret was determined to get back, not for love, but for revenge. She started to realise that if she couldn't be the power in Scotland through her husband, she'd be the power through herself. She began to learn the art of the political pivot, which is basically 16th century speak for lying to everyone until you get what you want. She left her baby daughter in England, which seems harsh, but that was royal life, and headed back north in 1517. She didn't have an army, she didn't have a plan, she just had a name and a very long memory. The border was different this time. She wasn't a bride in white damask. She was a woman in black looking for a way back into the game. The return to Scotland wasn't exactly a red carpet affair, more of a, oh, it's you again sort of vibe from the locals. And Margaret found herself trekking back into a hornet's nest with a husband who was behaving like a total rotter. Angus was at it again. He wasn't just cheating, he was basically playing house with a woman named Janet Douglas. No relation, which is its own kind of weird in those circles. And he was doing it with Margaret's money, which is enough to make anyone's blood boil. It's like finding out your ex has moved into your flat and is using your favourite mug to serve tea to their new partner. Margaret was livid. She didn't just sit there, no. She started writing letters to her brother Henry, basically asking for a divorce, which was a massive deal back then because you couldn't just hop onto a website and file some papers. You had to convince the Pope that your marriage was a spiritual mistake. Henry, the king of the do as I say, not as I do school of thought, was horrified. He told her that divorce was a sin. This coming from the man who would eventually break the entire church just to get a fresh start with Anne Boleyn. It's enough to make you laugh if it wasn't so infuriatingly hypocritical. She was stuck in a sort of social no-man's land. Then there was the Duke of Albany. He came back from France in 1521, and suddenly Margaret was playing a very strange game where she was being suspiciously nice to him. People started whispering. They said they were too close. They said they were plotting to get rid of Angus together. Maybe there was a bit of a spark there, or if she was just using him because he had the soldiers and the money she lacked. Albany was sophisticated. He had that French flair. And he wasn't Angus. That was probably his biggest selling point. Rumours are a nasty thing, especially in a court where everyone is bored. There was this one letter where an English agent basically told Henry that Margaret and Albany were inseparable, which in 16th century spy speak basically means they were having a go. Whether they actually were is anyone's guess. History is often just a collection of well-documented gossip, isn't it? Margaret denied it all, of course. She had to. If she admitted to an affair with a French-backed duke, her brother would have cut her off completely. She was essentially a double agent. She'd tell Albany one thing, then write to the English saying she was only doing it to protect their interests. It was exhausting. You can see it in her handwriting. It gets messier, more frantic. The ink blotting in places where she probably hit the page in frustration. She was also trying to deal with a series of health issues that sounded like a recurring nightmare. Stretches of time where she couldn't walk, or her arm would go numb. The political landscape was shifting under her feet like sand. By 1524, Albany had finally had enough of the Scottish reign and the stubborn lords, and he headed back to France for good. This was Margaret's moment. She erected the king. That's the term they used. She took her 12-year-old son, James V, to Edinburgh and declared him the actual ruler, effectively ending the Regency. She was the one standing behind him. She was the one holding the reins. It lasted about 5 minutes. The problem with declaring a 12-year-old a man is that all the other men in the room want to be his favourite advisor. Angus came back. He wasn't invited, but he showed up anyway, scaling the walls of Edinburgh like a common thief in the night. Margaret ordered the cannons on the castle to fire on him. Think about that for a second. She literally tried to blow her husband to bits with heavy artillery. That's not a difference of opinion. That's a I want you deleted from the earth level of hatred. The lords didn't like the noise or the mess. They eventually forced a compromise where Angus got to stay. It was the beginning of the end for Margaret's influence over her son. James was growing up, and he was starting to listen to the men who told him his mother was a nuisance. He was a teenager. We all know how teenagers are. Now imagine your teenager has a crown and the power to lock you in a tower if you annoy him too much. She turned to Henry Stuart. He was the younger son of Lord Avondale, and he became her new obsession. She made him the treasurer, the lieutenant of the guard. She basically showered him with titles to keep him close. It was a desperate move. She was trying to buy loyalty because she couldn't find it anywhere else. Stuart wasn't exactly a mastermind. He was just a guy who was in the right place at the right time. She finally got her divorce from Angus in 1527. The Pope finally came through, claiming that because of Angus's pre-contract with that other woman, the marriage to Margaret had never been valid in the eyes of God. It took her over a decade of fighting, pleading and bribing to get that piece of paper. You'd think she'd have learned her lesson about marriage. She didn't. She married Henry Stuart almost immediately. It was a private ceremony, probably in a small chapel with just a few witnesses away from the prying eyes of the court. When James V found out, he was absolutely livid. He didn't see a happy mother. He saw a woman who was making him look like a fool on the European stage. He didn't just disapprove, he arrested Stuart. Margaret had to go to her son and beg for her new husband's life. It's a recurring theme with her, isn't it? Fighting for men who weren't really worth the effort. She was a queen mother, the daughter of a king, the sister of a king, and she was grovelling to a 16-year-old boy for the sake of a minor noble. She was living in Stirling, then Perth, then whatever castle would have her. Money was always tight. Her brother wouldn't send any because he was mad about the divorce, and her son wouldn't give her any because he wanted her to stop meddling. She was reduced to selling her jewels just to pay the servants. One by one, the rubies and pearls she'd brought from England disappeared into the hands of moneylenders. She was becoming a ghost in the very kingdom she'd once ruled. There's something particularly savage about the way a mother fights when she realizes the very people supposed to be helping her are actually just waiting for her to trip, so they can snatch her child's future right out of his sticky little hands. Margaret was essentially living in a state of high alert paranoia that would make a modern conspiracy theorist look relaxed. And honestly, who can blame her when you've got the Earl of Angus sniffing around the throne like a hungry wolf at a butcher's shop window? She spent those middle years somewhere between the frantic escape to England and the eventual mess with Henry Stuart, acting as a human shield for James V, which sounds noble until you realise that shielding someone in the 16th century often involved a lot of shouting, some very dodgy backroom deals, and occasionally threatening to burn down a castle or two. She was stubborn, proper Tudor stubborn. She had this weird internal checklist of things she had to achieve before she could even think about having a sit-down and a nice cup of whatever passed for tea back then, though it was probably just watered-down ale because the water would kill you. One of her main goals was ensuring James wasn't just a king on a piece of paper, but a king who actually had a crown that fit, and a sword people were afraid of. She was playing this exhausting game of keeping the French happy enough to send money, but not so happy they started moving their furniture into Edinburgh, all while keeping her brother Henry VIII at arm's length. Henry was being a right pain. He kept sending these pompous ambassadors, men who probably spent 3 hours every morning just getting their hose to sit right, to tell her she was doing everything wrong. 16th century ambassadors were basically just spies who were too expensive to execute, and Margaret knew it. She'd smile at them, feed them some overpriced venison, and then go back to her room to write a letter to someone else entirely. She was a mother, sure, but she was a mother with her teeth bared. There was this moment in 1524 which people call the erection of the king, but it just meant they were declaring the 12-year-old James as the actual ruler. Margaret was the one who orchestrated the whole thing, dragging the boy to the High Kirk in Edinburgh and basically saying, "Look, he's the boss now, so everyone can just go home." It was a bold move, brave, or maybe just a bit desperate. She wanted the Regency over and done with so she could stop the lords from using the kid as a mascot. James, for his part, seemed to enjoy it. I mean, what 12-year-old wouldn't want to be told they own a country and can stay up as late as they want? He was a Tudor-Stuart hybrid, which is a genetic cocktail for disaster if you like things like stability or reason. He had his father's charisma and his mother's ability to hold a grudge until it turned into a diamond. Margaret thought she'd won. She hadn't. The Douglases were still there, like a bad smell that won't leave the carpet. Angus, that charming disappointment of a husband, was still insisting he had a right to be involved, and because he had the backing of the English crown, he was hard to shift. Margaret found herself in this bizarre position where she was the Queen Mother, but she was effectively being bullied by her own ex-husband in her own son's court. It's the kind of family dynamic that usually ends up on a trashy daytime talk show, but here it involved real armies and actual heads on pikes. Perhaps she just looked at the Scottish landscape, all that grey stone and purple heather, and wished she'd married a quiet English gardener instead. Probably not. She liked the drama too much. Or maybe she just didn't know how to live without it. She was constantly moving him, the king, from place to place. Holyrood, Stirling, Edinburgh Castle. It was like a very high-stakes version of Where's Waldo, but with more velvet and a higher chance of someone getting stabbed in a corridor. She was trying to build a wall of loyalty around him, but in Scotland, loyalty was something you rented. You didn't buy it. The lords were always looking for a better deal. They'd promise Margaret their lives and their swords on Tuesday, and by Thursday they'd be having a very cosy dinner with Angus, and talking about how difficult she was being. Difficult. It's a word men always use for women who aren't doing exactly what they're told, isn't it? Margaret was being difficult because she didn't want the Douglases to turn her son into a puppet. She saw what they were doing, controlling his access to information, deciding who he could talk to, basically making sure he only knew what they wanted him to know. She fought back with the only weapons she had, words and the boy's own affection for her. Kids are fickle, especially royal ones. James was starting to realise that the Douglases were giving him stuff, horses, dogs, the freedom to go hunting whenever he wanted, while his mother was always there with her plans and her letters and her worries. He started to drift. It's heartbreaking in a way. She'd sacrificed everything to keep him on that throne, and now the boy was starting to look at her like she was the one holding him back. She was losing her grip. Every time she tried to secure a new alliance, Angus would undermine it. Every time she tried to get Henry VIII to send some cash without strings attached, he'd attach a whole ball of yarn and a few lead weights. She was drowning in diplomacy. She even tried to get the French to send an army to help her kick Angus out. But the French were busy with their own problems and couldn't be bothered with a Scottish domestic dispute. She'd been the Princess of England, the Queen of Scotland, and now she was just a woman trying to figure out if the guard at the door was on her payroll or the Douglases. It's enough to give anyone a permanent headache. She started to rely more and more on Henry Stuart around this time. Maybe he was just someone who actually listened to her. Someone who didn't try to explain her own job to her. Heaven knows she needed a win. But Scotland doesn't give out wins very often. It gives out long winters and bitter rivalries. Margaret was learning that protecting the crown wasn't just about the physical object. It was about the soul of the person wearing it. And James's soul was being pulled in 20 different directions at once. She was using her mother's teeth to bite back at everyone, but she was starting to realise she might be biting the very person she was trying to save. There was a rumour, one of those nasty bits of gossip that sticks, that she was actually considering turning James over to the English just to keep him away from Angus. I don't believe it for a second. Margaret might have been a lot of things, but she wasn't a traitor to her own blood. She was just exhausted. She stayed at Stirling for a while, making it her base of operations. It's a formidable place, Stirling Castle, high up on the rock. If you stand on the walls, you can see for miles. You can see who's coming, but you can't see what they're thinking. And that was Margaret's biggest problem. She could see the armies, but she couldn't see the betrayals until they were already happening. She kept the king's household running on a shoestring budget. She was selling off pieces of her own history just to buy bread and wine for the court. A gold cup here, a silken gown there. It was a slow liquidation of her identity, but as long as James was safe, she seemed to think it was worth it. Or at least she told herself it was worth it. We all tell ourselves lies to get through the day, don't we? The day was coming when she wouldn't be able to protect him anymore. Not from Angus, and certainly not from himself. Choosing a husband in the 16th century wasn't exactly like picking something out of a catalogue, though for Margaret it might as well have been a catalogue of worst possible options. And Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus, was right there on the front cover looking all brooding and heroic, while secretly being a complete and utter bark. You have to understand the headspace she was in during the summer of 1514 because she'd been a widow for less than a year. She was surrounded by Scottish lords who treated her like a suspicious parcel left on a doorstep, and her brother, back in London, was being his usual, overbearing self. She was lonely. The whole plan to bugger off across the border was less of a strategic retreat and more of a get me out of this madhouse before I lose my mind sort of affair, because by 1515, Margaret was basically a prisoner in her own palaces. Albany had the kids. Angus was being about as useful as a chocolate teapot. She was pregnant. Again. It really is a wonder these women survived at all, isn't it? She decided she'd had enough of the Scottish lords and their constant bickering nonsense, so she made a break for it. It wasn't a carriage with silk pillows, it was a horse. A cold, damp, miserable horse. She rode, in the dark. You have to picture the borders back then. It wasn't just a line on a map with a polite sign saying, "Welcome to England." It was a wasteland. A buffer zone full of people who didn't care about kings or queens, only about how many cows they could pinch before sunrise. She was terrified. Or maybe she was just too tired to be scared. I suspect she was just numb. She was heading for Harbottle Castle, which sounds like a place you'd go for a nice weekend away. But in reality, it was a grim, freezing fortress that probably hadn't been dusted since the Romans left. It was October. Northumbria in October is basically a wet sponge. She was ill. Really ill. The records talk about a fret or a fever, which could mean anything from a bad cold to her body finally saying, enough is enough. She was so weak she couldn't even stand. They had to carry her into the castle. What about the laundry situation in these border forts? Did they even have soap? Or did everyone just smell like wet wool and wood smoke? Probably the latter. It's not a pleasant thought. She went into labour there, on a cold floor, in a draughty room with nothing but some stressed-out maids and a few rough soldiers outside the door. She gave birth to Margaret Douglas. This little girl would go on to be a right handful later in life. Granddaughter of one king, niece of another, mother of a murder victim. But for now, she was just a tiny, screaming bundle in a cold castle. Margaret was so far gone she didn't even know if the baby had survived. She stayed in that bed for weeks. Angus, meanwhile, was being a total pill. He'd come with her, mostly because he had nowhere else to go. But the moment he realised that life in an English border fort involved a lot of sitting around and being told what to do by his brother-in-law's officials, he got restless. Mind you, Angus was the kind of man who needed an audience to feel like he existed. Without the Scottish court to impress, he was just a guy with a fancy name and no money. He actually abandoned her there. Can you believe it? She's lying in bed, barely able to lift a finger, recovering from a birth that nearly killed her, and he just packs his bags and goes back to Scotland to make a deal with the very people she was running away from. He left her with the baby. And the debt. She wasn't the same woman. She was thinner, probably. Harder. She didn't expect a warm welcome, she just wanted her son. She reached Lamberton Kirk, the same place where she'd first met James IV all those years ago. The irony must have been thick enough to choke on. Back then she was a bride. Now she was a woman with no husband, no home, and a very large chip on her shoulder. She found that Scotland had moved on without her. Albany was still in charge, but he was getting tired of the constant bickering. The lords were still fighting. And Angus. Oh, Angus. He didn't even come to meet her at the border. He sent a message saying he was busy. Mind you, he was busy with another woman. Imagine the gall. You've just spent 2 years in exile, nearly died giving him a daughter, and he can't even be bothered to show up for the homecoming. It was a brutal reality check. She realised she was alone. Completely alone. No one in England was going to help her, and no one in Scotland wanted her back. She had to carve out a space for herself, using nothing but her wits and her name. She was a Tudor in a world that hated Tudors. She had to start playing a very different kind of game. A game where you don't trust anyone, least of all the people who say they love you. She moved to Edinburgh, but she didn't have a palace. She had a house, a small, cramped house where she could hear the neighbours and smell the street. From Queen of the North to a woman in a rented room, it's a hell of a fall. But she was still breathing, and as long as she was breathing, she was a threat. Coming back to Scotland was a bit like trying to re-enter a burning building, because you realised you left your favourite pair of shoes inside, only to find the shoes are on fire and the floorboards have already turned to ash. It seemed she'd decided then and there that if no one was going to play fair with her, she wasn't going to play fair with anyone else, and so she started this incredibly dangerous game of playing the English and the French off against each other like a bored kid poking two different hornet nests with the same stick. She'd write these desperate, tear-stained letters to her brother Henry VIII, telling him she was his only loyal servant in a land of barbarians and that he really ought to send her some money. And then 5 minutes later, she'd be in a corner whispering with the French faction about how her brother was a bully who didn't understand the Scottish soul. I've always thought that 16th century letters must have been a nightmare for the postal workers. I mean, imagine carrying a bag full of treason across a rainy moor while trying to remember which spy is currently working for which side. It's a lot to keep track of. Mind you, the ink they used back then was often made from oak galls and iron salts, which meant it literally ate into the parchment over time. If you look at some of her original letters today, they look like they've been chewed by tiny, very literate insects. Anyway, Margaret was in Edinburgh, but she wasn't in the castle. She was stuck in a smaller house listening to the street fights outside. There was this one event in 1520 called Cleanse the Causeway, which is such a polite name for what was actually a massive bloody brawl in the middle of the Royal Mile between the Douglases, her husband's lot, and the Hamiltons. It was a proper street war with swords and polearms and people falling over barrels of fish. Angus won that one, which you'd think would be good for Margaret, but all it did was make him more arrogant, more untouchable, and more annoying to live with. He was basically a human migraine. She started looking for a way out of her marriage, which in those days was about as easy as trying to find a salad in a Tudor butcher shop. The Duke of Albany, who had been chilling in France and probably enjoying the wine a lot more than the Scottish drizzle, was invited back by the lords who were fed up with Angus. Margaret, surprisingly, was one of the people cheering the loudest for his return. This was a massive pivot. Her brother Henry was livid. Henry VIII giving moral advice or political guidance is like a shark lecturing you on the benefits of a plant-based diet. And he couldn't believe his sister was siding with a man who was essentially a French agent. But Margaret didn't care. She saw Albany as her ticket to freedom, or at least her ticket to getting Angus out of her house. It's possible they were more than just political allies. We don't know if they were actually lovers. Honestly, Albany seems like the type who'd be more interested in his silk hosen than in a complicated relationship with a temperamental Queen Mother. But the perception was enough to ruin her reputation in London. Henry VIII's chief advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, who was basically a walking personification of a velvet-covered brick, started writing these scathing reports about her. She was caught in the middle. Again, mind you, she was also trying to get her daughter back, little Margaret Douglas, who was still in England. Henry was holding the child like a hostage to keep his sister in line. It's a bit grim, really, using a toddler as a bargaining chip, while you're also trying to manage a national reformation and a divorce from a Spanish princess. But Margaret Tudor was learning to be just as cold as her brother. She realised that in Scotland, you didn't need to be loved, you just needed to be useful. She began to send secret messages to the French king, Francis I. She promised him that if he supported her, she'd make sure Scotland stayed firmly in the old alliance and turned its back on England. Then she'd turn around and tell the English ambassador, Lord Dacre, that she was only pretending to like the French so she could spy on them. It was a double cross within a triple cross, a bit like a spy movie where everyone has 3 different passports and a fake moustache. I wonder if she ever got confused. Did she ever wake up and forget which lie she told to which earl? There was this one moment where she was trying to convince the Scottish Council to let her have more control over the young King James V, who was about 9 or 10 at the time. She argued that a boy needed his mother. The lords argued that a king needed to be a man. It's that classic struggle of the era, the biological reality of a child king versus the political necessity of a warrior leader. Margaret was desperate to get James away from the Douglases, who were essentially grooming him to be their puppet. What she actually felt for James. Was it maternal love? Or was it the realization that he was her only real source of power? Maybe both. Human emotions aren't usually neatly packaged into little boxes, are they? We can love someone and also realize they're our only way to pay the rent. She spent a lot of time at Stirling Castle during this period. It was her sanctuary. She'd look out over the cast toward the Highlands and wait for news. Any news. News from Rome about her divorce. News from London about her brother's latest whim. News from France about a fleet of ships that never seemed to arrive. The waiting must have been the worst part. The silence of a cold stone room when you know your enemies are laughing in a tavern just a few miles away. She was also dealing with constant health problems. I mentioned her having the palsy in one of her arms. Now, in the 16th century, medicine was basically a mixture of prayer, bloodletting, and eating things that should never be near a human mouth. They probably told her it was caused by melancholy or unbalanced humours. In reality, it was probably just the sheer, unadulterated stress of having every man in your life try to steal your job and your kids. Her brother Henry wasn't helping. He sent her a letter basically telling her that her soul was in danger because she was being mean to Angus. The irony. It's like a professional pyromaniac telling you to be careful with a box of matches. Margaret just kept pushing. She helped Albany organise a massive raid on the English border in 1522. It was a total failure. The Scottish army got to the border, looked at the English defences and basically said, "Actually, we're not feeling it today," and went home. Albany looked like a fool. Margaret looked like a traitor. It seemed like the game was over. But Tudors don't just stop when they lose a hand. They just ask for a new deck and a different set of rules. She was about to make the biggest gamble of her life, and it didn't involve the French or the English. It involved her son. She was going to take the boy and make him the king in more than just name, even if she had to burn every bridge back to London to do it. The whole erection of the king in 1524 was essentially a high-stakes publicity stunt designed to make the 12-year-old James V look like a man while Margaret pulled the strings from behind a velvet curtain, which worked for about 5 minutes until the Scottish lords realised she didn't have enough gold in the basement to keep them from grumbling about her latest fancy man. It was a bold move, very Tudor. She paraded him through Edinburgh. The crowd cheered, mostly because they liked a spectacle and probably because it hadn't rained for at least 20 minutes. Edinburgh is stunning when the sun hits the castle, but it's a bit of a climb if you're wearing 40 pounds of brocade and have a dodgy knee. Anyway, she shoved Albany out the door. He went back to France and stayed there this time, and she was finally maybe the boss. But then Angus comes back. He always comes back. Like a persistent rash or that one friend who never gets the hint that the party is over. He'd been in France and England, sucking up to Henry VIII, and he showed up at the gates of Edinburgh with a smug look and a letter from the English king saying he should be in charge of the boy's education. I have mentioned this event repeatedly. Margaret told the guards to fire the cannons, literally. She tried to blow her husband up. "No, we need to talk. Just aim for the guy in the fancy hat." The lords didn't have the stomach for a civil war over a marital spat, so they let him in. He eventually seized the king. James was a prisoner for 3 years. He hated it. He hated Angus. He probably started to resent his mother for not being able to stop it. During this mess, she finds Henry Stuart. He was the younger son of Lord Avondale, and while he wasn't a political heavyweight, he was young and loyal, and, most importantly, he wasn't Archibald Douglas. She made him lieutenant of her guard. People talked. Of course they did. They said she was a shameless woman, which is just what men call women who have a preference for someone they haven't approved of yet. She was desperate for that divorce. She sent agents to Rome with bags of gold and promises she couldn't keep. Her brother Henry was currently trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon, so the Pope was a bit busy. It took forever. Finally, in 1527, the word came through. She was free. Or at least, free enough to marry Stuart and make everything 10 times more complicated. Then comes 1528, the year everything flipped on its head like a pancake in a pan handled by someone who's had a bit too much wine, because James V, who was now 16 and had grown into this tall, moody teenager with a very sharp Tudor nose and a deep burning hatred for his stepfather, decided he was done being a puppet. He escaped. It was like a movie. He dressed as a groom, snuck out of Falkland Palace in the middle of the night, and rode like the wind to Stirling where his mother was waiting. Imagine the sheer panic in the Douglas camp when they woke up and realised the teenage boy they had been treating like a slightly annoying pet had vanished into the mist, leaving nothing but an empty bed and a lot of very confused guards who probably realised right then that their heads were about as secure as a loose tooth in a gale. Angus was finished. He fled to England. James was the king, for real this time. Margaret thought this meant she'd be back in the inner circle, whispering in his ear and deciding who got to keep their head. James wasn't interested in a co-ruler. He gave her a house and some money, but he kept her at a distance. He even threw her new husband, Lord Methven, into prison for a bit just to show he could. It's a bit of a slap in the face. After all she'd done, all the letters, all the fleeing through bogs. Maybe he blamed her for the Angus years. Maybe he just wanted to be his own man. James could be a bit of a nightmare when he didn't get his way. He once supposedly burned a woman at the stake just because her family was related to Angus. He had that Tudor streak. It wasn't pretty. She spent her final years trying to keep the peace between her son and her brother, which was like trying to keep two rabid dogs from fighting over a bone. Henry VIII wanted James to break with the Pope. James wanted to stay Catholic. Margaret was caught in the middle, writing to Henry that James was a good boy, and writing to James that Henry was just being a loving uncle. Neither of them believed her. She was getting older. The palsy was getting worse. She lived at Methven Castle, watching the seasons change and probably wondering if any of it had been worth it. She died in 1541, after a stroke that left her unable to speak. She asked for Angus on her deathbed, not because she loved him, but because she wanted him to have the inheritance for her daughter. Or maybe she just wanted to make sure he knew she was still haunting him. She didn't get to see her granddaughter, Mary Queen of Scots, be born. That would happen just a year later. She was buried at the Carthusian Priory in Perth. It's gone now, destroyed during the Reformation. There's not even a stone to mark where she lies. Just the wind and the grass and the memory of a woman who refused to stay in the box they built for her. I wonder if she'd be happy knowing her blood eventually sat on the English throne anyway, through her great-grandson James VI. She probably would have laughed. Thank you for listening.